There are over 600 million Muslims in the world today, about 1/7 of the total population of the earth. The Muslim world stretches from Morocco in the west to Indonesia in the east, as far north as Siberia and south to Zanzibar. With outposts scattered across the globe, it makes up the most recent of the great world religions. Islam. Islam began in the deserts of Arabia, nearly 600 years after the death of Christ. Uniting the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, it quickly turned them into an irresistible force. Language and culture, arts and science, all flourished under the aegis of Islam, whilst in the West, Europe was trapped in the doldrums of the Dark Ages. Recent events prove that the magnetic power of Islam is undiminished, even today. To non-Muslims, Islam today remains a potent and mysterious force. How did it begin, and what were the reasons for its explosive growth in the century that followed the death of its founder, Muhammad? A century of conflict between the Byzantines and the Persians had left both empires weak and vulnerable. As a result of these constant wars, trade routes were disrupted, and merchants began to send their goods by the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula. Vast caravans journeyed along the coasts of the Arabian Peninsula, carrying the exports of Africa and Asia to Egypt, Persia, and the Byzantine Empire. Trade flourished, and one Arabian town in particular grew into a prosperous trading center at the crossroads of routes that extended to India, Madagascar, and the Philippines. That town was Mecca. Today, Mecca is the holy city of Islam, and every year in the great annual pilgrimage or Hajj, millions of Muslims arrive from every corner of the globe to worship here. What happened to make this desert town the center of one of the world's great religions? Since ancient times, Mecca had been a holy place where the tribes of Arabia worshipped their pagan gods at the shrine of the Kaaba. But the growth of the new trade routes exposed the Arabs to new ideas, and they began to question traditional beliefs and values, whilst the wealth brought by trade caused a new class system to emerge. And then, at the end of the 6th century, a prophet was born in Mecca who would abolish the old gods forever and transform the old pagan shrine into the center of a new monotheistic religion, Islam. That man was Muhammad. Muhammad was 40 years old when God revealed the message of Islam to him. Tradition has it that Muhammad received a visitation from the angel Gabriel. "Recite," commanded the angel. "What shall I recite?" asked Muhammad. Then the angel said, "Recite in the name of thy Lord, who created all things, who created man from a clot of blood. Recite, for thy Lord is most generous." Then Gabriel instructed Muhammad to sweep away the traditional idolatry and worship of many gods, and to put in its place the worship of Allah, the one true and almighty God. God's revelations to Muhammad are written down in the pages of the Quran, the holy book of Islam. This one was produced in the 9th century at Kairouan. The words of the Quran are the words of God himself. Islam means submission to the will of God, and the one God of the Muslims is the God of the Jews and the Christians as well. Muslims accept the authenticity of some Old Testament prophets, including Abraham, Isaac, Moses, and Noah. They accept the concept of a last judgment, and they recognize Christ as a prophet, although not as a son of God. But for Muslims, the last and greatest, the seal of the prophets, is Muhammad. At the time of the revelation to Muhammad, however, most people in Mecca preferred the old gods and the old ways. Muhammad made many enemies with his message of submission to the one God. The ancient shrine, the Kaaba, which contained over 300 sacred stones, statues, and other objects, was a major attraction. Many merchants relied for their prosperity on the steady influx of pilgrims who came to worship there. Resentment against Muhammad grew, and he and his followers suffered attacks and ultimately persecution. In the face of this mounting hostility, Muhammad withdrew from Mecca with a small band of followers in the year 622 to the town of Medina, 180 miles to the north. This migration to Medina, known as the Hijra, marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Here, Muhammad and his followers established the first Muslim state and built the first mosque on the site presently occupied by the Mosque of the Prophet, where Muhammad is buried. After a series of battles lasting 8 years, Muhammad finally returned in triumph to the gates of Mecca at the head of an army of 10,000 men. He was allowed to enter the city and demanded the keys of the Kaaba, the ancient pagan shrine, and destroyed the idols. He then ordered his muezzin, or prayer leader, to climb up to the roof of the Kaaba and call the faithful to prayer in words which are still heard today from the minaret of every mosque throughout the world. Since that time, the Kaaba in Mecca has always been the center of the Islamic world, and every Muslim turns towards Mecca to pray, wherever he happens to be. As a prophet, Muhammad was unusual. During his lifetime, he became a temporal as well as a spiritual leader, galvanizing the military potential of the warring Arab tribes and replacing their many tribal gods with one true God, Allah. The combination of temporal and spiritual power lent an element of sanctity to the activities of raiding and conquest, and the conquered territories became part of an empire that was both religion and state at the same time. In 632, Muhammad died. He had created an empire based on Medina, which included the Hejaz, Yemen, and Oman. His successor, Abu Bakr, the first caliph, went on to gain the entire Arabian Peninsula. Once united, the Arabs advanced with phenomenal speed. Under the second caliph, Omar, Syria, Egypt, North Africa as far as Tripoli, and Mesopotamia were brought under Arab rule. The succeeding caliphates of Uthman and Ali extended Arab dominion to the Caucasus Mountains to the north and the Iranian plateau to the east, the Persian Empire eventually being conquered in 657. All these formidable military achievements took only 30 years. Wherever they went, the Arab conquerors were often welcomed as liberators by the oppressed and persecuted Jews and many Christians, particularly members of minority sects. However, in 656, the rivalries surrounding the succession to Muhammad developed into civil war. In 661, the victors, who were members of the old merchant aristocracy of Mecca, led by the Umayyad family, seized control of the caliphate. Their first move was to transfer the capital to Damascus, and from there they continued the thrust eastwards. Following the conquest of Herat and Balkh in 651 and the fall of Kabul in 664, the way was open to India and Central Asia. Sindh in northwest India was occupied in 712 and has remained Muslim ever since. Further north, the Arabs pressed on beyond the Oxus River, occupying Bukhara and Samarkand in 710 and reaching the frontier of the Chinese Empire, where they defeated the Chinese army at the Talas River in 751. This defeat severed the cultural ties between China and Central Asia and marked the beginning of China's isolation from the West. By now, Islam was also a sea power, having occupied the dockyards at Alexandria. The Arab advance continued along the North African coast, overcoming resistance by the Berber tribesmen and crossing the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain in 711. Here, divisions amongst the Christians made conquest easy, and they continued north to Toulouse and the Rhone Valley, but they were defeated at Poitiers by the Franks in 732. It was only a frontier skirmish, but it persuaded the Arabs to withdraw into Spain. It was only in Anatolia and the Balkans that Islam failed to make any headway. 3 separate sieges of the Byzantine capital Constantinople in the late 7th and early 8th centuries failed to give Islam a foothold at the gateway to Eastern Europe. This did nothing to detract from Islam's immense achievements. The heart of the vast empire was secure. Islam as a religion was advancing and winning converts everywhere. The gathering together of so many different regions under a single rule stimulated commerce and inaugurated a period of great prosperity. Nevertheless, the end of this period of expansion marked a turning point. By now, the Arab descendants of Muhammad's original followers were in a minority everywhere. Secure within their citadels and garrisons, like this one at Kairouan in Tunisia, they lived comfortably off the taxes collected from their subject peoples. However, there was growing discontent amongst the non-Arab converts to Islam, who were excluded from the privileges enjoyed by the Arab ruling class. A small number of Arabs, mostly soldiers and officials, were prospering from the skills and industry of millions of conquered peoples, many of them heirs to higher and older cultures. Muhammad died without leaving any clear guidelines as to how his successors should be chosen in the future. Tragically, the seeds of a major conflict had been sown, a conflict which still divides Islam today. The Sunnis, the majority, claim that the Prophet's authority passed to the caliphs, leaders approved by the community. The Shi'is believe that Muhammad's authority passed to his cousin and son-in-law, Ali, and to his descendants, the Imams. Muhammad had united the warring Arab tribes under the banner of Islam, and it was his intention that Muslims should never go to war against Muslims. And yet, within 25 years of his death, conflict had broken out over the question of the succession to the caliphate. It may not have been fought with bombs and guns like the all-too-numerous wars of today, but the cost in human suffering was equally great. And finally, it was that Arab civil war that led to the unseating of the Umayyads in 750. The seizure of power by the new dynasty, the Abbasids, brought major changes to the empire. The capital was transferred from Damascus in Syria to Iraq, where the second Abbasid caliph, al-Mansur, ordered the construction of a magnificent new city at Baghdad. The change of capital heralded the end of the unchallenged Arab domination of Islam, as power and influence gradually passed out of the hands of the conquering Arab minority to the millions of non-Arab Muslims. A multitude of nations and races lived under a common Islamic culture, united, along with the Arabs, by their belief in Allah and his messenger Muhammad. Throughout the empire, Arabic was the universal language. Under the Abbasid caliphs, this Islamic imprint led to a great flowering of Islamic art and culture. In the 9th century, the Caliph al-Mamun, seen here in his bathhouse, established a house of science in Baghdad. Here, scholars studied algebra, astronomy, and the works of Euclid, Galen, and Aristotle were translated from Greek into Arabic, thus preserving much of the great classical heritage. However, by the middle of the 9th century, the unity of the empire began to falter. Over the next 150 years, the caliphs in Baghdad became mere figureheads. A number of local dynasties became established, and Abbasid rule declined. There were separate dynasties in Morocco, the Idrisids, in Tunisia, the Aghlabids, in Egypt, the Tulunids, precursors of the Fatimids, in the Yemen, the Zaydis, in Transoxania, the Samanids, and in Afghanistan, the Ghaznavids, who founded an extensive kingdom in northern India. With so much political fragmentation, why did the power and influence of Islam continue to flourish during the centuries that followed? A major part of the answer must lie in its religious toleration, a principle enshrined in the Quran. Islam did not insist upon conversion, and specifically protected the so-called people of the book, the Christians, the Jews, and the Persian Zoroastrians, a fact which explains the persistence of Christian and, until recently, Jewish communities in many parts of the Arab world. And so, during the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, under the patronage of the rich and the powerful, architects, artists, and scholars produced a magnificent testament to the skills and durability of Islamic art and culture. The Islamic ban on representing living figures, although not universally observed, contributed to the development of a rich repertoire of calligraphic forms. These were used in the decoration of religious texts, and also found architectural expression in highly decorated palaces and mosques. Even today, textiles are produced which are vivid examples of the Islamic tradition of calligraphic artistry. This early 13th century ewer was made in Persia. Rich colors were used not only for clothing, but in pottery, glassware, and in the decoration of houses and mosques. This striking use of color counterbalanced the barren desert landscape that made up so much of the Islamic Empire. As the Arabs lost their appetite for war and conquest, the role of defenders of the empire passed to the Seljuk Turks. These fierce warriors from Central Asia won control of Baghdad in 1055 and quickly dominated the whole of the eastern half of the Islamic world, with the exception of the Arabian Peninsula and India. In 1071, the Seljuk armies routed the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert. They went on to occupy most of Anatolia and Asia Minor, which they made a Seljuk dependency. The supremacy of the Seljuks throughout the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean made pilgrimage to the great shrines of Christendom impossible. Several attempts by crusaders from Western Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries to regain control of the holy places led to the creation of a number of small crusader states in Palestine and Syria. But in 1187, these were virtually wiped out by the Islamic armies of the Ayyubids under Saladin. The Islamic faith continued to spread across the world over the next 3 centuries. In the East, traders and missionaries carried it to Indonesia and the Malay Peninsula, and then on to Sumatra, Malaya, Ceylon, and the Laccadive and Maldive Islands. In Africa, Muslim traders traveled the great caravan routes across the Sahara to the Kingdom of Mali as early as 1350, and later to the Hausa states in what is now Nigeria. Architecture and its decoration remain among the most impressive products of Islamic culture. The great mosques and mausoleums which were built all over the Muslim world, such as the Mosque of Gur Emir in Samarkand and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, remain as magnificent testaments to Islamic skills. Islam had begun as a jihad, or holy war, to carry the word of the Prophet to all the inhabitants of the earth. Its earliest achievements were remarkable, but by its extraordinary impact upon the conquered peoples, it entered on the inheritance of the ancient world and became its heir. The transmission of Greek learning came from Alexandria and other centers of classical culture, but it says much for the Abbasid caliphs that they fostered this process. It is one of the marks they have left on history. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, says the Quran.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah.
From its cradle in Arabia, Islam grew into one of the world's great civilizations. Bridging the centuries, it was an important lifeline between the classical world and the European Renaissance. Christian scholars went to Muslim Spain to copy scientific treatises and transcribe the works of Aristotle and his Muslim interpreters. The renaissance of Western thought and the rise of the European universities in the 12th and 13th centuries owe much to the intellectual legacy of the mighty empire founded 14 centuries ago by the last of God's prophets, Muhammad.